Rome is remembered as the cradle of civilization, law, order, progress. But behind its roads and monuments was an empire powered by fear, slavery, and public death. This is not Rome the textbooks celebrate. This is the Rome that ruled through terror and called it civilization. If you want it even darker, faster, or more mysterious, say the word, and I'll tweak the tone. If you want more real, uncensored history, the stories textbooks avoid, subscribe to the channel. New documentaries every week, exploring the darkest truths behind civilization. History doesn't repeat itself by accident. Stay curious, stay informed. Chapter 1. The Empire that sold civilization to the world. For more than 2,000 years, Rome has been remembered as the architect of civilization. Roman roads still shape modern cities. Roman law underpins legal systems across Europe and beyond. Aqueducts, forums, and amphitheaters stand as symbols of order, engineering, and progress. To later generations, Rome presented itself as the force that brought stability to a chaotic world. But this image was not accidental. It was carefully constructed. From the late Republic onward, Rome mastered the art of presenting conquest as benevolence. Expansion was framed not as invasion, but as liberation. Roman writers described conquered lands as backward, disorganized, or dangerous, places that required Roman control for their own good. The Latin term imperium did not simply mean rule, it implied a right to command. This narrative was reinforced physically, in stone and marble. Triumphal arches celebrated victories, while omitting the cost. Reliefs depicted Roman soldiers as disciplined and restrained, their enemies as faceless and defeated. Monuments like Trajan's Column, erected in 113 CE, told a continuous visual story of conquest in Dacia, yet the scenes of mass displacement, enslavement, and execution were stylized or absent. What remained was a message: Rome brings order. History itself followed the same pattern. Most surviving accounts of Rome were written by elite Roman men, senators, generals, administrators. Figures like Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius shaped how Rome would be remembered. Their works are invaluable, but they reflect the worldview of the ruling class. The voices of the conquered, Gauls, Iberians, Britons, Judeans, largely survive only through Roman descriptions of them. Those descriptions were rarely neutral. Resistance was labeled rebellion. Survival was labeled barbarism. Entire cultures were reduced to stereotypes that justified domination. When Julius Caesar wrote his Commentary de Bello Gallico in the 50s BCE, he presented the Gallic wars as a defensive necessity. Modern estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands died, and many more were enslaved. Caesar's account framed it as pacification. Roman civilization followed a familiar pattern. Roads allowed armies to move faster. Cities allowed taxation to be enforced more efficiently. Law applied differently depending on status. Citizens, non-citizens, and enslaved people lived under entirely separate legal realities. Order existed, but it was hierarchical and enforced through violence. This contradiction sat at the heart of Rome's success. The empire promised stability, but it depended on fear to maintain it. The grandeur of Rome's public image concealed civilization was real, but so was the brutality that sustained it. By the 1st century CE, Rome ruled tens of millions of people across 3 continents. It had sold the idea that its dominance was natural, even necessary. But beneath the roads and laws lay a question that Roman history rarely confronted directly. Chapter 2. Violence as entertainment, blood for the masses. In Rome, violence was not hidden. It was organized, scheduled, and celebrated. By the late Republic and early Empire, public brutality had become a central feature of civic life. Gladiatorial games, executions, and animal hunts were not fringe spectacles, they were state-sponsored events, funded by politicians and emperors to display power and secure loyalty. What modern audiences might see as cruelty, Romans understood as tradition, discipline, and order. The origins of gladiatorial combat lay in funeral rites. Early contests were staged to honor elite dead, transforming human death into public ritual. By the 1st century BCE, these private ceremonies had evolved into massive public events. Julius Caesar expanded the scale dramatically, staging hundreds of fighters at once. Under Augustus and his successors, the games became permanent institutions of the imperial system. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, symbolized this transformation, capable of holding more than 50,000 spectators. It was engineered not just for entertainment, but for control. Admission was free, seating was strictly hierarchical, senators closest to the arena floor, women and the poor pushed higher. The structure itself mirrored Roman society. Inside the arena, death followed rules. Gladiators were trained professionals, owned by schools known as ludi. Some were enslaved prisoners of war, others criminals, and a small number were volunteers seeking fame or money. Combat was ritualized, but the risk was real. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 20% of gladiatorial bouts ended in death. Depending on period and location, executions were even more explicit. Condemned criminals, rebels, and enslaved people were killed publicly during midday intervals. Roman writers referred to this portion of the games bluntly: meridiani, the noon killings. Victims were burned alive, crucified, or mauled by animals. These deaths were meant to instruct as much as to punish. The venationes, staged hunts, extended violence beyond human targets. Exotic animals were imported from across the empire. Lions from North Africa, leopards from Syria, bears from the Alps, even elephants. Thousands were slaughtered in single festivals. Under Emperor Trajan, celebrations following the Dacian Wars reportedly lasted 123 days and resulted in the deaths of over 11,000 animals. According to Cassius Dio, the message was clear: Rome commanded the natural world as completely as it commanded people. Violence in the arena reinforced social hierarchy. Only certain bodies were expendable. Roman citizens were rarely subjected to public execution. That fate was reserved for non-citizens and the enslaved. The crowd learned repeatedly who mattered and who did not. Obedience was rewarded with survival. Defiance ended in spectacle. Ancient sources confirm that audiences were active participants. Crowds shouted, gestured, and demanded death or mercy. Emperors watched closely. Granting a reprieve could earn popularity, denying it could demonstrate authority. The arena became a space where power flowed both ways, but only within strict limits. Over time, exposure normalized brutality. Children attended the games. Philosophers like Seneca criticized the bloodshed, describing crowds made cruel by habit. Yet even critics accepted the institution's permanence. Violence had become routine, absorbed into Roman identity. These spectacles were not chaos. They were controlled displays of dominance, repeated often enough to feel inevitable. Rome did not merely conquer territories, it conditioned its population to accept cruelty as order. But the blood spilled in the arena was only one expression of Rome's dependence on human suffering. Because beyond entertainment, the empire was sustained by a system far more pervasive and far more invisible. Slavery. Chapter 3. Slavery, the engine. Rome could not run without slavery. Was not a peripheral institution in the Roman Empire. It was structural. Without it, Roman society as it existed could not function. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had absorbed millions of enslaved people through conquest. Entire populations were taken after wars in Gaul, Greece, Hispania, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Enslavement was not limited to warfare. Piracy, debt, birth into slavery, and criminal punishment all fed the system. Modern historians estimate that in Italy alone, enslaved people may have made up between 20 and 30% of the population. In some regions, they likely outnumbered free citizens. Roman law defined enslaved people as property, not persons. They could be bought, sold, beaten, tortured, or killed with little legal consequence, especially during the Republic. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, held near total authority over everyone under his control, including enslaved workers. This legal framework normalized extreme violence as routine management. The work assigned to enslaved people depended on location and demand. In agricultural estates known as latifundia, enslaved laborers worked under constant supervision, often in chains. Conditions in mines were even harsher. Roman sources describe mining as a death sentence. Enslaved workers there were worked until they collapsed and died. Household enslaved people sometimes experienced better material conditions, but remained vulnerable to sexual exploitation, punishment, and sale at any moment. The empire's economy depended on this system. Enslaved labor built roads, extracted minerals, harvested grain, staffed workshops, and maintained elite households. Their labor generated the surplus that funded the army, the games, and the urban population of Rome itself. Free citizens increasingly relied on state distributions of grain, while enslaved people produced the food that made those distributions possible. This imbalance created fear. Roman elites understood that their wealth rested on a population that vastly outnumbered them and had every reason to resist. Laws prohibited enslaved people from gathering freely or carrying weapons. Collective punishment was common. If an enslaved person killed their owner, all enslaved people in that household could be executed, regardless of guilt. The purpose was deterrence through terror. Revolts did occur. The most famous was led by Spartacus between 73 and 71 BCE. Tens of thousands of enslaved people defeated Roman armies and moved freely across Italy for nearly 2 years. When the rebellion was finally crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, approximately 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies displayed for miles as a warning. The message was unmistakable. Slavery also shaped Roman morality. Philosophers debated whether enslaved people possessed reason, while accepting the institution itself as natural. Even Stoic thinkers who argued for humane treatment did not challenge slavery's legitimacy. The system was too deeply embedded. Rome's greatness, its wealth, and its stability were inseparable from mass unfreedom. The empire presented itself as orderly and rational, but its foundation rested on legalized dehumanization. Control was not just enforced through law or spectacle, it was enforced through ownership of human lives. An empire built on such a system required constant vigilance at the top. Fear flowed upward as much as downward. And in Rome, that fear concentrated in the hands of a single man. Chapter 4: Emperors, Paranoia, and Absolute Power. The Roman Empire was governed by a paradox. It claimed to preserve the Republic's traditions while placing unprecedented authority in the hands of one individual. From the reign of Augustus onward, emperors ruled not through a formal crown, but through accumulated powers that, in practice, were absolute. Augustus, who ruled from 27 BCE to 14 CE, understood the danger of appearing openly autocratic. He presented himself as princeps, the first citizen, while quietly controlling the army, the treasury, and the law. His system worked because it disguised domination as continuity. But once power was centralized, it could not easily be restrained. Later emperors inherited not just authority, but suspicion. The imperial court became an environment defined by surveillance and fear. Informers, known as delatores, were rewarded for accusing senators and officials of treason, impiety, or disloyalty. Trials often required little evidence. Confiscated property enriched the state, but the emperor personally. The system encouraged betrayal as a survival strategy. Several emperors became synonymous with paranoia, not because they were uniquely unstable, but because the structure of power encouraged it. Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE, executed or exiled members of his own family and inner circle. Ancient sources describe erratic behavior, but modern historians note that many accounts were written by hostile elites after his assassination. What is clear is that his reign normalized the use of terror to maintain authority. Nero, ruling from 54 to 68 CE, relied heavily on executions and forced suicides. Senators, generals, and even his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, were eliminated when they were perceived as threats. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, Nero shifted blame onto Christian communities, ordering arrests and executions that Roman historians later described in detail. These actions reinforced the emperor's power through fear, but they also deepened public resentment. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, blurred the line between emperor and spectacle. He fought in the arena as a gladiator, a role considered disgraceful for a ruler. Senators were forced to applaud. His participation was not entertainment, it was domination. To oppose him was to risk death. Absolute power destabilized the empire from within. Succession was rarely peaceful. Emperors were assassinated by guards, rivals, or court officials. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire saw over 20 emperors rise and fall in rapid succession, many murdered shortly after taking power. The office itself became a liability. Fear shaped decision-making. Emperors increasingly relied on purges rather than trust, punishment rather than reform. Loyalty was temporary. Survival required constant vigilance. The concentration of power created a feedback loop. Violence at the top justified violence below. Law became a weapon. Dissent became treason. The emperor was elevated beyond accountability, yet perpetually at risk. Rome's rulers demanded obedience from millions, but they ruled in isolation. Their authority depended not on stability, but on intimidation. And intimidation did not stop at the palace walls. It was written into the very system Rome called justice. Chapter 5. Law, Justice, and Legalized Cruelty. Roman law is often celebrated as one of the empire's greatest achievements. Its principles influenced legal systems long after Rome's political collapse. Yet within the empire itself, law functioned less as a guarantee of fairness and more as a mechanism of control. Justice in Rome was not equal. Legal rights depended on status: citizen, non-citizen, freed person, or enslaved. Roman citizens enjoyed protections that others did not. They were generally exempt from torture, public execution, and degrading punishments. Non-citizens and enslaved people were not. Torture was a routine investigative tool. Roman courts accepted physical pain as a legitimate means of extracting truth, particularly from enslaved individuals. Testimony from enslaved people was often considered invalid unless obtained under torture. The assumption was clear: suffering produced honesty. This belief was embedded in legal practice for centuries. Punishments were designed to be visible and humiliating. Crucifixion, reserved primarily for enslaved people, rebels, and non-citizens, was intended to prolong agony and deter resistance. Victims were displayed along roads, outside cities, or in public spaces where their deaths become warnings. Decapitation, a quicker and less degrading death, was typically reserved for citizens of higher status. Collective punishment reinforced obedience. If unrest occurred in a province, entire communities could be fined, displaced, or executed. After the suppression of revolts, survivors were often enslaved en masse. Roman commanders understood that terror could pacify regions more efficiently than negotiation. Public shaming was also codified. Convicted criminals could be paraded through the streets before execution. Property confiscation accompanied many sentences, ensuring that punishment enriched the state. Legal proceedings thus served political and economic interests as much as moral ones. Even within the citizen class, justice favored the powerful. Wealthy Romans could delay trials, influence juries, or avoid punishment through exile. The poor faced harsher penalties for lesser crimes. Legal inequality was not a flaw, it was a feature. Roman law emphasized order above all else. Stability justified severity. The system functioned effectively because it discouraged dissent before it emerged. Fear was built into the legal process, shaping behavior long before any trial occurred. This structure supported the broader imperial system. Law reinforced hierarchy. Punishment reinforced obedience. Mercy was discretionary, not guaranteed. Rome governed through rules. Those rules were calibrated to preserve dominance, not fairness. The empire did not merely conquer territory, it institutionalized control through legal violence. Yet law alone was not enough. To maintain loyalty across vast distances and diverse populations, Rome relied on something more subtle. It shaped how people saw the empire itself. Through symbols, stories, and spectacle, Rome taught its subjects what to believe. Chapter 6. Propaganda, Myth, and the Manufacturing of Loyalty. Rome understood that power was not sustained by force alone. It had to be seen, felt, and believed in. Across the empire, loyalty was manufactured through carefully constructed images, narratives, and rituals that turned domination into legitimacy. Architecture was among Rome's most effective tools. Temples, forums, baths, and amphitheaters were built in conquered cities using a standardized visual language. These structures were not only functional, they were symbolic. They announced Roman presence, Roman order, and Roman permanence. To live within a Roman city was to live inside Rome's worldview. Monuments rewrote reality. Triumphal arches commemorated military victories without acknowledging the destruction that made them possible. Emperors were depicted as calm, disciplined, and divinely favored. Even defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals or moral victories. Public space became a continuous lesson in obedience. Coins carried propaganda into daily life. Emperors' faces circulated across thousands of miles, stamped with titles like Augustus, Pater Patriae, and Divi Filius, son of a god. These images reinforced the emperor's authority every time a transaction occurred. For many subjects, coins were the most consistent representation of imperial power they ever saw. Public rituals completed the message. Triumphs paraded conquered peoples and spoils through Rome's streets. Captives were displayed, humiliated, and often executed at the conclusion of the celebration. The message was unmistakable. Rome's enemies were defeated, its gods victorious, its rule justified. Mythology merged with politics. Emperors traced their lineage to divine ancestors. Augustus linked himself to Aeneas and Venus, embedding his reign within Rome's sacred origin story. Later emperors were deified after death, and sometimes during life. Loyalty to the state became intertwined with religious duty. Dissent, meanwhile, was reframed as disorder. Those who resisted Roman authority were labeled enemies of peace. Cultural practices that challenged Roman norms were dismissed as barbaric or dangerous. Over time, resistance disappeared not only from the battlefield, but from the historical record itself. The effectiveness of Roman propaganda lay in its subtlety. It did not always demand belief, it normalized it. Generations grew up surrounded by Roman symbols, speaking Latin, using Roman law, participating in Roman rituals. Imperial ideology became background reality. But propaganda could not conceal everything. Economic strain, political corruption, and social inequality continued to grow. Loyalty manufactured through imagery was fragile. When material conditions worsened, belief eroded. Rome's myths sustained the empire longer than force alone ever could. Yet they could not prevent internal decay. Behind the monuments and rituals, the cost of expansion accumulated quietly, in the provinces. Among conquered peoples who paid for Roman order with their lives. And when resistance emerged, Rome responded not with persuasion, but with annihilation. Chapter 7. The Cost of Conquest, Provinces, Genocide, and Resistance. Rome's power was built far from the city itself. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, conquest reshaped entire societies. Roman expansion was rarely peaceful, and when resistance emerged, the response was often devastating. Military campaigns aimed not only to defeat enemies, but to break them permanently. Roman commanders understood that terror could succeed where diplomacy failed. The destruction of communities, execution of leaders, and enslavement of survivors were deliberate strategies, not excesses of war. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE offer a clear example. In his own writings, Caesar described the near-total destruction of tribes that resisted Roman authority, including the Eber ones. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that hundreds of thousands were killed or enslaved. Entire regions were depopulated. Caesar framed these actions as necessary to secure peace, a justification repeated throughout Roman history. In Judea, resistance produced similar outcomes. The Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE was met with overwhelming force. Roman legions under Vespasian and later Titus destroyed cities, executed prisoners, and crushed armed opposition. In 70 CE, Jerusalem was captured and the Second Temple destroyed. Josephus, a contemporary historian, recorded mass killings and widespread enslavement. Tens of thousands were taken captive. Judea was devastated, its political and religious center erased. Britain experienced comparable brutality. Roman campaigns under governors like Suetonius Paulinus responded harshly to rebellion. After the uprising led by Boudicca in 60–61 CE, Roman forces slaughtered thousands. Tacitus noted that Roman reprisals made little distinction between fighters and civilians. Entire settlements were destroyed to restore order. Conquest did not end with military victory. Romanization followed. Local elites were pressured to adopt Roman customs, language, and governance. Traditional laws were replaced or subordinated. Indigenous religions were marginalized or absorbed. Cultural survival often required compliance. Population displacement was common. Survivors of rebellions were relocated or sold into slavery. Land was redistributed to Roman veterans and settlers. These measures secured control but fractured societies. Trauma became generational. Resistance movements rarely survived in written history. Roman authors dismissed them as banditry or treachery. Leaders were vilified. Causes were simplified. What remained was a narrative of inevitable Roman dominance. Yet resistance never fully disappeared. Rebellions continued across the empire. From North Africa to the Danube, each uprising revealed the same reality. Roman rule was maintained through constant coercion. The cost of conquest was not limited to the battlefield. It lingered in ruined cities, displaced peoples, and cultures stripped of autonomy. Rome expanded by breaking worlds and rebuilding them in its own image. Such methods produced results, but they also planted instability. An empire sustained by violence required endless enforcement. Over time, the weight of control became unsustainable. And as inequality deepened and trust eroded, Rome's foundations began to crack from within. Chapter 8. Moral rot, inequality, and the beginning of collapse. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire faced pressures that no army could fully suppress. The systems that had once ensured stability, wealth extraction, military dominance, rigid hierarchy, began to undermine the state itself. Rome's decline was not sudden. It was gradual, structural, and deeply tied to the moral and social contradictions at its core. Wealth in the empire became increasingly concentrated among a small elite. Senators and imperial families accumulated vast estates, while small landholders struggled to survive. As independent farmers disappeared, they were replaced by tenant laborers bound to the land. Economic mobility narrowed. For many, Roman citizenship no longer promised opportunity, only obligation. Urban life reflected this divide. Rome and other major cities relied on state-provided grain distributions to prevent unrest. These programs maintained order but discouraged productive labor. Meanwhile, enslaved and coerced workers continued to fuel the economy. The imbalance between producers and dependents strained resources and eroded civic responsibility. Political participation also declined. The republic's ideals of shared governance had long since faded. Ordinary citizens had little influence over imperial policy. Decisions were made by emperors, military commanders, and bureaucrats removed from daily realities. Loyalty was no longer earned through inclusion, it was demanded through fear. Violence became the default response to instability. Rebellions were crushed rather than addressed. Economic grievances were ignored. The empire relied increasingly on military force to solve administrative problems. Armies were expensive, and maintaining them required heavier taxation. Provinces bore the burden, deepening resentment. Corruption further weakened institutions. Offices were bought, favors exchanged, and laws bent to protect elite interests. The legal system, once a source of legitimacy, became another tool of exploitation. Trust in authority declined. The crisis of the 3rd century exposed these weaknesses. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire endured repeated invasions, civil wars, economic collapse, and rapid turnover of emperors. Many rulers were proclaimed by armies and killed shortly after. Stability vanished. The image of Roman permanence fractured. Fear, once effective, lost its power. When survival became uncertain, obedience eroded. Communities prioritized local protection over imperial loyalty. The empire fractured not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked cohesion. Rome attempted reform. Emperors like Diocletian restructured administration, imposed price controls, and expanded bureaucracy. These measures slowed collapse but did not resolve underlying inequality or restore trust. Control increased as legitimacy declined. The empire endured for centuries more in various forms, but the foundations had shifted. Rome was no longer sustained by shared identity or belief in its mission. It survived through inertia and force. Its fall was not merely political. It was moral. An empire that normalized domination eventually consumed itself. Yet Rome did not disappear. Its systems, assumptions, and methods outlived the empire itself, carried forward into new states, new ideologies, and new forms of power. Chapter 9. Rome's Dark Legacy, the empire that never really died. The Roman Empire collapsed as a political entity in the West in the 5th century. But its influence did not end. Rome's systems endured, replicated, adapted, and institutionalized by the powers that followed. The empire fell, yet its methods survived. Roman law became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Concepts of citizenship, property, punishment, and authority were inherited by medieval kingdoms and modern states alike. These frameworks carried forward Rome's assumptions about hierarchy and control. Law promised order, but it also preserved inequality. Imperial punishment left a lasting mark. Public executions, corporal punishment, and legal torture appeared in later societies. Not as innovations, but as traditions. The spectacle of state violence, used to deter, discipline, and demonstrate authority, followed a Roman model. Power was displayed, not hidden. Rome's mastery of propaganda also endured. Monumental architecture continued to symbolize legitimacy. Rulers built palaces, capitals, and ceremonial spaces to project permanence and dominance. Political imagery remained central to governance. Coins, flags, statues, and later mass media echoed Rome's understanding that belief sustains authority. As effectively as force, colonial empires adopted Roman logic almost directly. Expansion was justified as civilization. Indigenous cultures were labeled inferior. Resistance was framed as disorder. Rome had established the template, conquest recast as progress. Even the language of empire persisted. Terms like barbarian, province, and imperial authority carried Roman meanings into new eras. The worldview survived even when the empire did not. Yet Rome's legacy is not only institutional, it is philosophical. The empire normalized the idea that order justifies cruelty, that stability excuses inequality, and that power defines truth. These assumptions reappear whenever states prioritize control over justice. Studying Rome's darkness is uncomfortable because it feels familiar. The empire's contradictions, civilization built on violence, law enforced through fear, unity achieved through domination, are not confined to the ancient world. They echo across history. Rome reminds us that progress is not neutral. Roads, laws, and cities can coexist with exploitation. Order can mask suffering. Civilization can be selective in who it protects. History is shaped by those who record it, and Rome recorded itself well. Its monuments endured. Its texts survived. The victims of its systems rarely left written accounts. To understand Rome honestly is not to deny its achievements, but to see their cost clearly. Empires do not simply fall, they transform, and the most enduring part of Rome was never its armies or emperors. It was the idea that domination, once normalized, can be mistaken for order. History is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget.